Nobody wakes up on a Saturday morning and says, today I'm going to join a riot. But they do wake up believing that they're doing something right, necessary, moral. They believe that they're standing up for something or against something. That matters. And in a free society, that instinct is not just understandable, it's legitimate. Every group in this country is entitled to grievances. Every community feels pressure somewhere, cultural, economic, political, moral pressure. And the right to protest these pressures is a cornerstone of any society that calls itself free. You see, protest built the modern world. Workers' rights were not handed down politely. Women didn't receive the vote because they whispered nicely. The American civil rights movement did not succeed because people stayed at home. But figures like Martin Luther King Jr. understood something very powerful. Protest can be disruptive without being destructive. It can be forceful without being feral. So this isn't an argument against protest. It's an examination of what happens when protests lose discipline. Because history shows us something very uncomfortable. Peaceful gatherings can become volatile very quickly. Not because the majority want violence, but because of psychology. You see, when individuals enter a large crowd, something subtle happens. Identity shifts. Personal accountability softens. Responsibility diffuses. The French social psychologist Gustave Le Bon wrote about this in the 19th century. He observed that individuals in crowds begin to think less as independent moral agents and more as part of this collective organism. The crowd literally develops its own emotional rhythm. And in that state, emotion spreads faster than reason. Anger travels quicker than nuance. And once the emotional intensity crosses a certain threshold, it doesn't take many people to alter the direction of the whole group. In any large demonstration, the crowd is not one mind, it's layered. At the outer layer, you have the majority. Ordinary people. They've come to show support and solidarity, to be counted, to stand with others who share their concern. They're not looking for confrontation. They've got jobs, families, responsibilities. They want their voice to be heard, not chaos. Now, inside that majority is a more committed core. These people are ideologically driven. The organisers, the activists, the people who've studied the issue, who feel it deeply. They're disciplined, focused, sometimes quite intense. And they believe strongly in their righteousness of their cause and themselves. And then on the edges of that core, there's a smaller but very critical subset. Those people drawn to confrontation. Sometimes they're angry. Sometimes they're thrill seekers. Sometimes they simply believe escalation forces attention. They're very few in number, but they're emotionally charged and they can change the outcome of the day. And outside all of this, you've got the most underestimated group, and that's the swing group. They're not passive, they're not aggressive, they're responsive. They take their cue from the energy around them. If the atmosphere remains calm, they remain calm. If the atmosphere shifts, they shift with it. And that is the anatomy of the crowd. But here's where the volatility enters. If the emotional intensity is already high, if speeches are inflamed, if opposing groups are nearby, if the police presence feels provocative, it does not take many people to tip the balance. A single bottle thrown, a barrier pushed, a clash at the perimeter. And this is when the confrontational minority will act and the swing group will react. The majority hesitate, they're shocked, uncertain, they're unsure whether to leave or stand firm. But within minutes, the character of the gathering changes. What began as solidarity becomes a spectacle. The cameras turn, the lines harden, the narrative literally writes itself. Escalation is rarely the will of the majority. It's usually the action of the minority interacting with the emotion of the day. Sometimes that minority emerges organically. It's the anger spilling over, poor crowd management, lack of leadership. But history has already shown repeatedly that movements can and will be infiltrated or manipulated by actors who benefit from the chaos. You know, the FBI got caught out doing this a lot in the 60s and 70s, and they were infiltrating activist groups to disrupt and discredit them. That's not speculation, it's documented, and it has happened repeatedly ever since. Because if you think about it, in the modern age now, the ecosystem is even more complex. Movements are amplified online before they ever even reach the street. We know that the algorithms reward outrage. We've got the media cycles which reward conflict. We've got funding streams that can support causes for reasons that we don't even understand. Non-state actors, political foundations, foreign influence campaigns, they all exist in the modern information environment. Now, that doesn't mean that every protest is orchestrated, but it does mean that no protest or demonstration can exist in a vacuum. But beyond all that, beyond the infiltration, beyond the agitation, beyond the funding, there's a much deeper issue. We've simply lost the art of debate. We no longer know how to disagree without dehumanising. We no longer know how to argue without assuming malice. We no longer know how to sit in a room with someone who sees the world differently and say, explain your position fully, I will listen. Instead, we label, we reduce, we meme, we chant. But when the debate dies, the street becomes parliament, and the street is a very poor parliament. What we're witnessing in the modern protest culture is often not ideological clarity, but emotional alignment. Groups with very different philosophies find temporary unity through shared grievance. Shared opposition can feel like shared identity, but opposition is not the same as coherence. Anger, whilst it can glue people together quickly, rarely builds anything durable. This isn't about criticising any one group, because every group will believe it is defending something important, and often they are. But when movements are driven primarily by outrage rather than structured argument, they become very combustible. A polarised society is a fragile society. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Division doesn't need any master puppeteer. It simply requires incentives. You see, outrage is profitable. Conflict generates clicks. Simplification mobilises far faster than nuance. In that environment, the loudest voices crowd out the wisest ones. Meanwhile, ordinary people from every background all want similar things: safety, dignity, opportunity, stability, a future for the children. The tragedy is that these shared desires are rarely platformed, whereas conflict is. But imagine something different. Imagine structured public debate returning as a cultural norm. Imagine community forums where opposing groups agree to rules of engagement, timed arguments, cross-examination, moderated discussion, a shared commitment not to victory, but to clarity. Imagine the activists from opposing sides sitting down not to shout, but to articulate their strongest arguments. Imagine identifying genuine areas of disagreement and genuine areas of common ground. Because here's the reality. Most issues are not binary. Most grievances contain both valid concerns and flawed assumptions. But you cannot uncover either in a chanting crowd. Protest is right, but dialogue is a responsibility. If we relearn the discipline of debate, real debate, we reduce the risk of emotional escalation. We make it harder for small antagonistic elements to hijack momentum. We make it harder for manipulation to succeed. We make it harder for the swing group to be pulled by this raw emotion. And perhaps most importantly, we begin to see each other again as citizens, not enemies. Because every group's entitled to speak. Every group is entitled to organise. Every group is entitled to advocate. But none of us are entitled to abandon reason. The solution to grievance is not suppression, it is engagement. The solution to anger is not escalation, it's articulation. If we continue to replace argument with outrage, then yes, we will continue to see volatility. Not because violence is inevitable, but because unmanaged emotion in large numbers is unstable. If we choose something harder, slower, less glamorous, less viral, if we choose debate over chanting, clarity over slogans, courage over conformity, then the street does not have to burn to be heard. We don't need fewer protests. We need stronger minds inside them. We don't need silence. We need better arguments. And perhaps, if we can relearn how to sit across from someone we profoundly disagree with and say, let's reason this out, we might discover that a path forward was never through the mob, but through each other.